Hello friends and welcome to Medieval Screen Finds. Tonight, our quiet exploration will lead us into a shadowed corner of the 100 Years' War, a conflict that carved deep lines across the face of medieval Europe. We will consider a figure whose name, whispered through the valleys and over the hills of France, could conjure both awe and a chilling dread. Edward, the Black Prince. He is often painted in hues of noble chivalry, a brilliant commander, a knight of unparalleled prowess. Yet, in the quiet corners of history, a different image persists, one etched by the scorched earth of Aquitaine and the desperate cries from Limoges. It is the image of the Butcher of Bordeaux. We will not dwell on the sensational, nor rush through the grim realities. Instead, we will gently unfold the layers of strategic ambition, the terrifying, yet measured, tactics employed, and the profound, often quiet, impact his passage had on the lives of ordinary people. This is the story of a presence that meant widespread destruction, a slow, undeniable sense of dread, and the quiet shaping of a legend, both celebrated and feared. So, before you settle in, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always intriguing to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Perhaps light an incense or two for that soothing fragrance. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. A quiet hum of expectation. It settles over the royal nurseries, drifts through the stone corridors of Westminster, and eventually begins to echo across the entire realm. For on a tranquil summer's day in 1330, a son was born to King Edward III and Queen Philippa of Hainault. He was named Edward, like his father, and from his very first breath, the subtle currents of destiny began to pull at him. He was not merely a child. He was the eldest son, the heir apparent, the one upon whom the immense weight of a future kingdom would one day rest. Expectations, like ancient tapestries, were woven around him from his earliest days, expectations of kingship, of leadership, and, perhaps most profoundly, of military might. His education, therefore, was not merely academic. It was a careful, deliberate forging. The young Edward was immersed in the rigorous training typical for a medieval prince destined for the battlefield. The rhythm of his days was set by the thud of sword on shield, the thrum of a bowstring, the steady cadence of a horse's hooves across a practice yard. Horsemanship, swordsmanship, archery, these were not just skills, but the very language of his future. Alongside these martial arts, he absorbed the intricate dance of military strategy, the careful calculations of troop movements, and the psychological interplay of command. And, always, the code of chivalry was presented, a gleaming ideal to strive for: honor, courage, loyalty, and courtesy. This was the outward veneer, the noble framework that would often be invoked, even as the grimmer realities of warfight tested its boundaries. As he grew, so too did the weight of his responsibilities and titles. He was created Earl of Chester, a foundational earldom. Then, Duke of Cornwall, the first to hold that newly established ducal title. And finally, in 1343, Prince of Wales, a title steeped in historical significance, linking him directly to the conquest and integration of that defiant land. Each title was a quiet step, a gentle elevation, signifying his steadily growing importance within the English court and subtly preparing him for the weighty burdens of leadership that awaited him. These were not mere ceremonial adornments. They were deliberate acts designed to mold a prince into a potent symbol of English power. Yet, Edward's youth unfolded against a backdrop of escalating tensions, a simmering historical dispute that would soon erupt into a generational conflict: the 100 Years' War. The very air seemed charged with it, a low, persistent hum of disagreement. At its heart lay King Edward III's audacious claim to the French throne, a claim rooted in his mother Isabella's lineage. She was, after all, the daughter of the last Capetian king of France, Charles IV. But beyond this dynastic ambition, there lay a deeper, more enduring friction, the long-standing territorial disputes over Gascony, or Aquitaine as it was also known. This fertile, wine-rich duchy in southwestern France was a historical English possession, a precious foothold that the French crown constantly sought to reclaim. It was a constant source of quiet antagonism, a wound that refused to heal. From the English perspective, the war aims were clear, if often unstated in their full, brutal scope. Edward III sought to assert these English claims, to weaken the French monarchy's authority, and to secure tangible economic advantages from the rich lands of France. And for this, a particular strategy began to coalesce, a method of warfare that would become synonymous with English campaigns, the Chevauchées. Picture a mounted raid, not a grand siege, but a swift, devastating sweep across the land. It was designed not merely to engage enemy armies, but to economically cripple the French heartland, to spread psychological terror, and to force the French king into a decisive, often unfavorable, engagement. It was a strategy of scorched earth and shattered morale, a blunt instrument of war that the young Prince Edward would, in time, come to master with chilling precision. The quiet rhythms of Edward's princely training were shattered by the harsh reality of battle in 1346. At just 16 years of age, he found himself at Crécy, a small village in northern France, commanding the vanguard of the English army. This was no training exercise. This was a crucible of war. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the distant clatter of hooves over uneven ground. Early in the engagement, as the French cavalry pressed hard, a message was sent to his father, the king, requesting reinforcements. Edward III's reply, now legendary, resonated with a quiet confidence. Let the boy win his space. He refused to send aid, a calculated gamble, allowing his son to prove his mettle, his courage, and his leadership under the intense pressure of combat. The Battle of Crécy was a symphony of chaos and coordinated deadly efficiency. The French knights, weighed down by heavy armor and hampered by poor organization, charged repeatedly into the deadly hail of arrows unleashed by the English longbowmen. The longbow, a weapon of seemingly simple construction, became an instrument of profound destruction in the hands of disciplined English and Welsh archers. Volley after volley, arrows fell like deadly rain, piercing armor, felling horses, and sowing disarray. The English victory was decisive, a testament to tactical brilliance and the devastating power of the longbow. For Edward, it was more than just a victory. It was a profound, formative experience. It solidified his reputation, not just within the English army, but across Europe, as a formidable military leader, and it imbued him with a deep, quiet confidence in his own command abilities. Following the triumph at Crécy, Edward participated in the prolonged siege of Calais, an arduous undertaking that stretched for nearly a year, from 1346 to 1347. This was a different kind of warfare, a slow, grinding test of endurance and logistics. Here, he witnessed firsthand the quiet hardships endured by both besiegers and besieged, the biting cold, the ever-present hunger, the spread of disease, the endless waiting, and the intricate, often frustrating, political complexities of siege warfare. He saw how strategic patience and resourcefulness could be as crucial as a direct clash of arms. These experiences, though less dramatic than the open field of Crécy, were equally vital in shaping his understanding of the multifaceted nature of war. Minor campaigns and skirmishes also punctuated his youth, brief, sharp encounters that further honed his skills in command and maneuver, each a subtle lesson in the grim art of conflict. The quiet influence of his father, Edward III, was undeniably profound. The king was a highly successful, if often brutal, military tactician, a man with a clear strategic vision. He understood the power of economic warfare, the demoralizing effect of devastation, and the psychological leverage of a powerful, aggressive military presence. The young prince absorbed these lessons, not always explicitly taught, but deeply ingrained through observation and participation. While Edward the Black Prince would outwardly embody the high ideals of chivalry, a stark pragmatism, and at times, a chilling ruthlessness, began to emerge. His focus was clear: victory and the achievement of strategic objectives. Traditional knightly conduct, while certainly valued, would occasionally yield to the cold calculus of war. This was not a sudden transformation, but a gradual, subtle hardening, a recognition that the ideals of chivalry, however noble, sometimes bent under the immense pressure of realpolitik. He possessed an innate ability to command respect, a quiet authority that resonated with his troops. This, coupled with his willingness to share their hardships, fostered a fierce loyalty and a willingness to follow him into the most perilous campaigns. His soldiers knew he would demand much, but they also knew he would lead from the front, sharing their dangers. And beneath it all, a deep conviction simmered, a strong belief in the righteousness of the English cause, perhaps even a sense of divine mandate for his actions. In the quiet chambers of his own mind, this belief may have served to justify the increasingly harsh and devastating measures he would come to employ, framing them not as brutality, but as necessary instruments in a divinely sanctioned struggle. It was a comfortable narrative, one that would allow the noble knight to coexist, perhaps uneasily, with the emerging butcher. The gentle lapping of the Garonne River against the ancient docks of Bordeaux carried with it not only the scent of wine and distant seas, but also the quiet promise of a new chapter in the long, drawn-out conflict between England and France. Edward, now in the full bloom of his early 20s, arrived in Aquitaine in 1355, not merely as a royal visitor, but as the prince, invested with immense authority and a clear, singular purpose. He arrived not with the flourish of a fleeting dignitary, but with the quiet determination of a commander establishing a permanent, strategic base. The strategic importance of Aquitaine, also known as Gascony, was undeniable. It was the primary English foothold on the continent, a sprawling, fertile land whose produce, particularly its renowned wines, flowed across the channel to English markets, providing vital revenue for the crown. Yet, this very wealth made it a constant prize, relentlessly contested by the French crown and its ambitious local lords, making it a perpetual point of contention and a magnet for conflict. Edward's mandate from his father, King Edward III, was unequivocal: secure the duchy, raise a formidable army from its abundant resources, and prosecute the war with a new, more aggressive fervor from this newly established continental base. His arrival in Bordeaux was met with a mixture of quiet anticipation among his English and loyal Gascon supporters, and subtle apprehension from those whose loyalties were less certain or who feared the inevitable escalation of hostilities. The city, a bustling hub of trade, commerce, and administration, quickly became the vibrant heart of his new princely court. Here, he meticulously began the delicate work of attracting not only the loyal Gascon nobility, whose allegiance was absolutely crucial for effective governance and military support, but also the steady stream of English administrators, legal experts, and seasoned soldiers necessary to establish a firm, undeniable English presence and operational infrastructure. The quiet hum of activity at his court was constant and purposeful, a blend of meticulous military planning sessions, astute legal judgments rendered to establish order and authority, and the measured, often complex, diplomatic discussions necessary for effective governance in a diverse and often fractious region. The political landscape of Aquitaine itself was a complex tapestry, intricately woven with threads of shifting loyalties, ancient feudal feuds, and pragmatic self-interest. Control was fragmented, resembling a patchwork quilt where allegiance could change with the turning of the seasons, the promise of new fortunes, or the perceived ebb and flow of power. Some Gascon lords remained steadfastly aligned with England, bound by generations of feudal fealty, strategic marriage alliances, or shared animosity towards the French king. Others quietly, or sometimes overtly, leaned towards the French crown, ever watchful for an opportune moment to switch allegiances or exploit any English weakness. Many, perhaps the majority, were pragmatic and self-serving, their loyalty a fluid commodity, readily shifting to whichever side offered the most immediate advantage, the least punitive demands, or the best chance for survival and prosperity. Edward had to navigate this intricate and often treacherous web with extreme caution and skill, understanding implicitly that military strength alone would not suffice. Diplomacy, shrewd persuasion, and the careful, consistent application of feudal law were equally vital tools in his arsenal for consolidating power. Economically, Aquitaine was a veritable jewel in the English crown, its thriving wine trade being of paramount and undeniable importance. The rhythmic clinking of barrels being loaded onto ships, the gentle creak of carts laden with rich, red wine trundling towards the ports, and the bustling activity of vineyards during harvest were constant sounds in the region, signifying a prosperity that both directly funded the English war effort and perpetually fueled French desires for its recapture. This economic bounty, however, was always shadowed by its inherent strategic vulnerability. Aquitaine was almost entirely surrounded by French territories, transforming it into a constant battleground, a salient exposed to continuous military pressure and economic disruption. The distant clatter of hooves over cobblestones, the quiet whisper of news from contested borders, and the ever-present threat of French raids were daily reminders of this precarious geopolitical position, ensuring that the region rarely knew true peace. Edward's initial efforts in Aquitaine were meticulously characterized by a carefully calibrated approach, a precise blend of assertive military displays designed to project strength, and subtle diplomacy aimed at securing allegiance and demonstrating undeniable English authority. He engaged in painstaking, often tireless, efforts to win over or coerce the recalcitrant Gascon nobility, understanding that their support was critical for long-term stability. This involved not just lavish banquets, generous gifts, and intricate political negotiation to secure alliances, but also swift, decisive military action against any lords or towns that dared to openly defy his authority or defect to the French. Feudal obligations, often a complex and contested legal framework prone to interpretation, were invoked and enforced with a quiet, unyielding determination, serving as a legal justification for his actions. His overarching aim was to solidify the foundations of English power in the duchy, piece by careful, strategic peace, creating a robust and defensible base for future operations. Simultaneously, the vital and continuous work of building a robust and highly effective army commenced with earnest. The recruitment, rigorous training, and meticulous organization of his forces were personally overseen by the prince himself. The core of his burgeoning army comprised seasoned English and Welsh soldiers, including the fabled longbowmen, whose disciplined volleys of arrows had already proven so devastatingly effective at the Battle of Crécy. To these formidable archers and men-at-arms were added significant numbers of Gascon levies, recruited from the local populace, and various companies of skilled mercenaries, creating a diverse but potent fighting force capable of both defensive holding actions and aggressive campaigns. The training grounds around Bordeaux buzzed with quiet but intense activity. The rhythmic thud of practice footwork, the measured shouts of command, the clash of practice swords, and the distinct, resonant twang of hundreds of longbow strings being drawn, indicating a constant state of preparation. These early years in Aquitaine were consistently punctuated by numerous smaller-scale campaigns, localized chevauchées, raiding expeditions, and swift, punitive expeditions launched into adjacent French territories or against rebellious Gascon lords. These initial forays were not yet the grand, sweeping destructions that would later define his more infamous reputation, but they served as crucial proving grounds for his evolving army and his own command. They allowed Edward to assert undeniable English authority in contested border areas, to gather vital intelligence on French troop movements, defensive strengths, and local resources, and to rigorously test the cohesion and efficiency of his newly assembled, diverse army in real-world combat scenarios. Each skirmish, each successful raid for supplies or intelligence, was a valuable lesson learned, a small victory that incrementally built confidence among his troops and further refined his tactical understanding of the unique challenges of warfare in the region. These initial actions were meticulously planned precursors to the larger, far more devastating Chevauchées that would soon be unleashed, allowing him to comprehensively assess the terrain, gauge enemy strength and weaknesses, and understand the intricate logistical challenges inherent in sustained, aggressive warfare in a foreign land. The quiet, ever-present hum of logistical and administrative challenges was a constant companion to Edward's command, often proving as daunting as any enemy army. Funding a large, constantly active army was a perpetual drain on resources, requiring ingenuity and often harsh measures. The initial reliance on infrequent remittances from England soon gave way to a more direct, and often brutal, dependency on plunder from captured territories and, increasingly, on direct taxation levied on the Aquitanian populace itself. This reliance on local resources, particularly the controversial hearth tax, feuage, would later sow deep seeds of resentment and ultimately contribute to widespread rebellion. Maintaining secure and efficient supply lines, a vital lifeline for his forces, was an ever-present and complex concern. Provisions, weaponry, armor, and vital reinforcements had to be moved efficiently from England across the often treacherous Channel, and then distributed across a diverse, challenging, and often hostile landscape within Aquitaine. The complexities of governing a diverse and often rebellious duchy while simultaneously waging an aggressive war on its borders were immense, requiring a rare combination of astute military acumen, diplomatic finesse, and administrative dexterity that Edward, despite his relative youth, steadily acquired. Through these early, demanding campaigns and his measured, yet firm, governance, Edward's reputation began to grow exponentially. His powerful presence in Aquitaine instilled a dual and contrasting response across the land. Among the French, a creeping, pervasive fear took root, a chilling recognition that this English prince was a formidable, relentless, and exceptionally dangerous force, a harbinger of potential devastation on an unprecedented scale. His name began to be whispered in hushed, fearful tones, a premonition of destruction. Yet, among his own troops and loyal Gascon allies, a profound and unwavering respect blossomed, born of his personal courage, his unwavering leadership in the thick of battle, and his consistent, undeniable successes. He was widely seen as a commander who led from the very front, sharing the immense hardships and demanding excellence from all ranks. The moniker Black Prince, while its full, chilling meaning would evolve over time through accounts of his darker deeds, found its quiet beginnings in these early years. There are indications from contemporary accounts that hinted at his fierce demeanor, his dark, imposing armor, or perhaps the terrifying impact of his presence on the battlefield, subtly foreshadowing the fearsome and legendary reputation that would eventually define him. He was no longer just the heir to the English throne. He was the undisputed Prince of Aquitaine, and the long, darkening shadow of his ambition and military prowess was beginning to stretch ominously across the ravaged landscape of France. His authority was asserted with a quiet, undeniable resolve, a steady, unhurried advance that spoke of power that was both potent and undeniable. He was becoming the constant, unavoidable presence that would forever shape the destiny of the land he now commanded. The quiet consolidation of power in Aquitaine was merely the prelude, the tightening of strings before a devastating release. For Edward, the Prince of Aquitaine, now fully established in his continental base, would soon unleash a form of warfare that would etch his name into the memory of France, not solely as a chivalrous knight of noble bearing, but as a chilling and relentless force of destruction. These were the Chevauchées, and their impact on the French countryside and its people was nothing short of a reign of terror, a deliberate, systematic unraveling of the very fabric of French life, designed to achieve specific military and political objectives through widespread devastation. The year 1855 saw the launch of what would become known as the Great Chevauchées, a campaign of unprecedented scale, reach, and brutality that marked a significant escalation of the conflict. Edward's strategic objectives were chillingly clear and ruthlessly pragmatic. Primarily, he aimed to draw the French king, John II, into a decisive open battle, a confrontation on terms favorable to the English, where he believed his disciplined longbowmen and seasoned troops could secure another overwhelming victory, reminiscent of Crécy. Beyond this immediate military goal, the campaign was meticulously designed to economically cripple the French heartland, to shatter its capacity to wage war by destroying its agricultural base and trade networks, and to demonstrate, in the most visceral and terrifying way possible, the overwhelming and undeniable power of the English crown and the futility of continued French resistance. From his base in Bordeaux, his army began its inexorable march, a path of devastation that swept through Languedoc, a rich and fertile region of southern France, leaving a trail of ruin that stretched as far as Narbonne on the distant Mediterranean coast. The quiet, centuries-old rhythms of agricultural life, the very heartbeat of the French economy, were abruptly and violently disrupted, replaced by the grim sounds of war and destruction. The tactics employed during these chevauchées were terrifying in their simplicity and horrifying in their consequences. The core principle was not about seizing and holding territory in the long term. It was about laying waste, about inflicting maximum economic and psychological damage. A systematic and deliberate burning policy left a literal scorched earth in the army's wake. Crops, heavy with the promise of harvest, the very sustenance of the populace, were indiscriminately put to the torch. Vineyards, painstakingly cultivated over generations, representing years of labor and future prosperity, were deliberately destroyed, their vines hacked down or set alight. Villages, often unfortified and completely unprotected, became quiet pyres, their timber frames collapsing into embers and ash, leaving behind only smoldering ruins. Even larger, unfortified towns, lacking robust defenses, suffered the same grim fate, their structures offering no solace or protection against the methodical and relentless advance of Edward's forces. This deliberate and widespread destruction was meticulously accompanied by widespread, systematic looting. Wealth, precious goods, and vast quantities of livestock were systematically plundered, not merely for individual gain by the soldiers, but to fund the English army's operations and to enrich the soldiers themselves, serving as a brutal and self-sustaining form of payment and motivation. Beyond this material acquisition, there were also chilling instances of taking prominent individuals prisoners for ransom, a highly profitable enterprise that could secure immense sums of money. The abduction of civilians for various, often grim, purposes, including forced labor or as human shields, also occurred, adding another layer of terror to the Chevauchées passage. The very air became thick with the acrid scent of damp earth and wood smoke, a constant, unsettling reminder of the recent passage of Edward's army, a pervasive odor of destruction that clung to the land long after the soldiers had moved on. During this terrifying and relentless progress, a quiet, almost eerie, inaction settled over the French royal court. King John II, acutely mindful of the catastrophic disaster at Crécy just 9 years prior, and perhaps overly cautious in the face of Edward's demonstrated tactical prowess, largely refused to engage Edward's army in open battle. This strategic reluctance, while perhaps understandable from a purely military standpoint given past defeats, ironically allowed Edward's forces to inflict maximum damage without significant opposition, deepening the devastation across the French countryside and amplifying the psychological impact on the beleaguered populace. The quiet grief, the silent despair that followed in the wake of the army, as survivors emerged from hiding to witness the ruin of their lives, was profound, widespread, and deeply felt, leaving lasting scars on the land and its people. The impact on the civilian population was truly catastrophic, a long, drawn-out agony that rippled through every aspect of life in the affected regions. While direct death from violence during the raids was certainly present, the true, enduring horror lay in the slow, grinding aftermath. Widespread starvation became a grim reaper, as vital crops were systematically burned and precious food stores plundered, leaving vast swathes of the population without sustenance. Disease, often exacerbated by malnutrition and the unsanitary conditions created by widespread displacement, swept unchecked through the population, leaving quiet grief and countless bodies in its wake, as people huddled in desperation without adequate shelter or basic sustenance. Exposure to the harsh elements, particularly as the colder seasons approached, added another brutal layer of suffering, claiming lives weakened by hunger and despair. Thousands upon thousands of peasants and townspeople, their homes reduced to ash and their livelihoods destroyed, were forced to flee, creating a desperate and widespread refugee crisis across the French countryside, adding to the instability and chaos. The economic ruin was not fleeting. It was long-term and devastating, crippling regions for decades. Agricultural land lay barren and unworked. Vital trade networks were shattered, and local economies, dependent on the quiet rhythms of production, exchange, and stability, collapsed, leading to widespread and enduring poverty that affected generations. The quiet determination and relentless effectiveness of Edward's campaigns continued into the following year, 1356, leading directly to the events that would culminate in the epochal Battle of Poitiers. Edward's army, having completed its initial, devastating Chevauchées and gathered immense spoils, began moving strategically north from Bordeaux, aiming to link up with English forces operating from Normandy, a critical maneuver that would consolidate English power. The French king, John II, now desperate to intercept Edward's army and prevent this dangerous junction, mounted a relentless and determined pursuit. He assembled a much larger army, confident that he could finally corner and crush the English prince. The two forces, like two opposing, irresistible tides, converged in a tense standoff near the city of Poitiers, setting the stage for one of the most significant battles of the 100 Years' War. The Battle of Poitiers, fought on September 19, 1356, was, for the English, another stunning testament to Edward's tactical brilliance and the devastating effectiveness of his army. He meticulously positioned his forces on highly advantageous defensive terrain, utilizing the natural landscape of hedges, marshes, and broken ground to his immense advantage, creating a formidable defensive barrier. Once again, the English longbowmen, hidden behind natural obstacles and in carefully prepared positions, proved devastatingly effective against the massed ranks of the French cavalry and dismounted men-at-arms. The French attacks were chaotic, marked by disunity among their commanders, a severe lack of coordination, and a fatal underestimation of the English defensive capabilities. Wave after wave of French knights and men-at-arms broke against the unseen wall of arrows, their charges faltering, their ranks dissolving into confusion and disarray under the relentless barrage. The battle culminated in the complete and utter rout of the French army, a catastrophic defeat, in a moment that sent shockwaves across the entire European continent. King John II of France himself was captured on the battlefield, alongside many of his leading nobles. It was an unprecedented victory for England, carrying immense political, military, and psychological consequences, fundamentally shattering the prestige and authority of the French monarchy. Following this monumental victory, Edward's treatment of the captured King John II appeared, on the surface, remarkably chivalrous and magnanimous. He famously served the king at dinner, comforted him with courteous words, and escorted him with dignity and respect first to Bordeaux, and eventually, across the Channel to England, where he was held in honorable captivity. This seemingly noble conduct stood in stark, almost jarring, contrast to the preceding brutality and widespread devastation of the Chevauchées and the immediate aftermath of the battle, creating a quiet dissonance that has puzzled historians for centuries. This apparent magnanimity was, however, a calculated act of astute political theater. By treating a captive king with such overt respect and generosity, Edward carefully upheld and enhanced his image as a noble, chivalrous knight in the eyes of Europe's aristocracy, a narrative he carefully cultivated. This public display simultaneously allowed him to benefit immensely from the immense spoils of war, including the vast quantities of treasure and ransoms collected, and from the immense ransom that would eventually be demanded for the king's release, which would fund English campaigns for years. It was a carefully constructed facade, designed to project a specific image of honor and virtue, while the harsh, brutal realities and immense profitability of his campaigns continued to unfold beneath the surface. Indeed, the psychological impact of Edward's reign of terror, particularly through the systematic Chevauchées, was profound and long-lasting. The constant, looming threat of his destructive raids instilled a deep, pervasive fear and dread across large swathes of France, paralyzing resistance and sowing widespread panic. Towns, desperate to avoid the complete destruction and suffering inflicted upon their neighbors, often paid protection money, exorbitant sums to spare themselves from the torch. It was during these relentless and brutal campaigns that Edward's chilling reputation began to firmly take hold among the French populace, a reputation that transcended mere military prowess. The widespread destruction, the quiet suffering of countless innocent civilians, and the relentless brutality of his tactics earned him the indelible, and to many, horrifying, moniker, Butcher of Bordeaux. This name, whispered in hushed, fearful tones in the devastated villages and across the ravaged landscape, solidified his image as a merciless and destructive force, a dark shadow passing over the land, leaving nothing but ruin and despair in its wake. It was a stark and powerful testament to the quiet, yet pervasive, terror he inspired, a terror that would forever define a significant part of his historical legacy. The quiet murmur of discontent, once a distant echo, grew steadily louder across Aquitaine, a direct consequence of the immense, unsustainable pressures of Edward's long and costly campaigns. The spectacular triumphs at Crécy and Poitiers, the strategic brilliance of the Chevauchées, had indeed elevated Edward to the pinnacle of military renown, securing him a place as one of England's most formidable commanders. Yet, this very success harbored the subtle seeds of decline, a slow, insidious erosion of the foundations upon which English dominance rested. The relentless financial burden of maintaining a large, active army and prosecuting a protracted war fell heavily upon the conquered and the protected, primarily through exorbitant and often arbitrary taxation. The feuage, a half-tax levied on every household regardless of income, became a particularly hated imposition, a constant reminder of foreign rule and economic exploitation. This deep financial strain, a quiet but pervasive source of grievance, slowly but surely began to fray the fragile threads of loyalty that bound the Gascon lords and the ordinary populace to the English crown. It was against this backdrop of simmering rebellion and growing economic hardship that the city of Limoges, a vibrant, significant urban center with a long and previously unwavering history of allegiance to the English, made a fateful, defiant decision. In 1370, its citizens, perhaps weary of the ceaseless English demands, the endless cycles of war, and emboldened by the growing resurgence of French power, took the radical step of opening their gates not to Edward, but to the forces of Duke Jean de Berry, a prominent French noble and a close relative of the French king. For Edward, who had personally invested years of tireless effort, immense resources, and a piece of his very soul into securing and administering Aquitaine, this act of defection was far more than a mere strategic loss. It was a profound, deeply personal betrayal. The news, reaching him as he battled a debilitating illness that already gnawed at his strength, ignited a cold, hard ember of fierce determination and a burning desire for vengeance within him. He resolved, with a chilling clarity that brooked no argument, to make an indelible example of Limoges, to send an unmistakable, terrifying message across the whole of France. Disloyalty to the Prince of Aquitaine would be met with an unforgiving, absolute retribution, a lesson etched in blood and fire. The sacking of Limoges in September of 1370 remains one of the darkest, most contentious chapters in Edward's storied military career, an event that forever cemented his brutal reputation in the annals of history and overshadowed many of his earliest chivalrous deeds. Despite the excruciating pain and profound weakness wrought by his rapidly deteriorating health, Edward, driven by a grim resolve to project an image of unwavering power and terrifying retribution, personally led his army to the city. The siege was conducted with grim efficiency and a chilling methodicalness. The English engineers, renowned masters of their craft, meticulously undermined a section of the city walls, working tirelessly beneath the earth, tunneling through the foundations, until a significant and irreparable breach was created. Through this gaping wound in Limoges' defenses, Edward's seasoned troops poured into the city, like an unstoppable tide. What followed was a massacre, an act of unbridled brutality that transcended even the grim, often violent, norms of medieval warfare. Unlike the usual practice in medieval sieges, where a city that surrendered might be spared its population, or at least its non-combatants, the accounts of the massacre at Limoges consistently describe a deliberate and widespread slaughter. While precise numbers vary due to the nature of historical reporting, the narrative is clear. Men, women, and even children were indiscriminately killed. The quiet hum of city life, the shouts of the besieged, and the desperate pleas for mercy were replaced by the chilling cacophony of terror, screams, the clash of steel, the guttural cries of soldiers, and the chilling thud of bodies falling. The question of Edward's direct role in this horrific event continues to fuel intense historical debate, a point of contention among scholars seeking to reconcile the chivalrous prince with the butcher. Was he physically present on the field, his voice hoarse with command, actively ordering the slaughter? Or was his debilitating illness so severe that he was merely a silent, perhaps semi-conscious, observer, his will and judgment clouded by pain and fever, tacitly permitting the brutal actions unleashed by his frustrated and vengeful soldiers? The answer remains elusive, shrouded by the passage of time and the limited, often biased, primary sources. Regardless of the precise degree of his direct command or his exact level of awareness, his undeniable presence during the massacre inarguably solidified his image as the Butcher of Limoges. This new, chilling moniker stood in stark, horrifying counterpoint to the chivalrous knight he had long cultivated, a dark shadow consuming his previous glory. The psychological and political ramifications of Limoges were immediate and far-reaching, reverberating across the continent and fundamentally altering perceptions of Edward and the English cause. News of the atrocity spread like wildfire, carried by terrified refugees and horrified chroniclers, deeply tarnishing Edward's once gleaming reputation for knightly chivalry among the courts of Europe. What little sympathy or respect some neutral parties might have harbored for the English cause evaporated in the face of such calculated cruelty. For the French, the massacre served as a potent, visceral confirmation of English barbarity, intensifying their hatred and stiffening their resolve to resist English occupation at all costs. It became a powerful piece of propaganda, a stark and horrifying example of foreign tyranny that fueled a fervent desire for vengeance and the complete liberation of their land. The name Limoges became a rallying cry, a symbol of French suffering under English rule, an enduring wound in the national memory. Coinciding tragically with this deepening stain on his legacy was Edward's relentless physical decline. The arduous Castilian campaign of 1367, undertaken in support of the controversial King Peter the Cruel, had been a Pyrrhic victory. While militarily successful, it had financially crippled his treasury, leaving him deeply in debt. More devastatingly, it left him afflicted by debilitating illness, most likely dysentery or another chronic, wasting ailment that sapped his life force. This great sickness progressively worsened over the ensuing years, a cruel and constant companion that slowly eroded his immense physical and mental strength. It diminished his boundless energy, clouded his once sharp strategic judgment, and profoundly impaired his ability to effectively govern the complex, rebellious Duchy of Aquitaine and to lead military campaigns with his characteristic vigor and tactical genius. The quiet, almost regal, authority that had once defined his command began to visibly wane, replaced by a profound, unmistakable weariness that settled deep within his bones. By 1371, forced to confront the undeniable reality of his failing health and the escalating, seemingly insurmountable difficulties in Aquitaine, Edward made the agonizing decision to return to England. It was an admission of defeat, a concession to a body that could no longer keep pace with his indomitable will. He left his younger brother, John of Gaunt, an able but far less charismatic commander, to manage the increasingly precarious and untenable situation in France. Edward's withdrawal created an immense vacuum, a moment of weakness that the shrewd and patient French king, Charles V, swiftly and brilliantly exploited. Often referred to as the Wise for his intellectual acumen and strategic foresight, Charles V adopted a fundamentally different and far more effective strategy than his impulsive father. He deliberately eschewed pitched battles, understanding the English advantage in open field engagements and remembering the costly lessons of Crécy and Poitiers. Instead, he initiated a methodical strategy of attrition, a slow but relentless regaining of lost territories through meticulous sieges, careful maneuvering, and the systematic harassment of English garrisons and supply lines. His brilliant constable, Bertrand du Guesclin, a master of guerrilla warfare and siegecraft, became the chief architect of this Fabian strategy. Under their combined leadership, the French slowly but inexorably eroded English gains, chipping away at their control with quiet, persistent pressure, like water wearing down stone. Many of the territories that Edward's devastating Chevauchées had so brutally won and held, often at immense human cost, were gradually lost back to the French during his prolonged illness and after his definitive departure. The tide of the 100 Years' War in Aquitaine had irrevocably turned, slowly but undeniably, ushering in a new, darker chapter for English ambitions in France and signaling the twilight of a legendary, if ultimately flawed, warrior prince. The gentle rocking of the ship across the English Channel, though a familiar sensation, must have felt profoundly different to Edward in 1371. His return to England was not the triumphant homecoming of a victorious general, but the quiet, somber retreat of a man whose once invincible body was failing, though his indomitable spirit remained, for a time, unbroken. Edward, the Black Prince, the formidable architect of English military dominance in France, the feared butcher of Bordeaux and now of Limoges, now faced his final, most personal and protracted battle, a silent, internal war against the relentless progression of illness. He never fully recovered from the debilitating ailment, likely a chronic dysentery or similar wasting disease, contracted during his arduous Castilian campaign 4 years prior. The vibrant energy that had propelled him across the muddy battlefields of France, the sharp, strategic mind that had orchestrated devastating chevauchées and decisive victories, slowly receded, leaving him increasingly weakened, confined, and profoundly weary. His final years were a quiet, protracted struggle against the ravages of disease, a poignant and stark contrast to the thunderous campaigns of his youth and prime, a personal siege that he ultimately could not win. During this period of his gradual decline, a subtle but significant shift began to occur in the intricate political landscape of England. With the reigning king, Edward III, also ailing and increasingly frail, his once formidable grip on power began to loosen, creating a vacuum that ambitious figures swiftly moved to fill. The immense burden of governance and the persistent pressures of the ongoing, seemingly interminable war in France fell heavily upon other prominent figures within the English court. Among these, his younger brother, John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, emerged as an increasingly dominant and influential force in English politics. While Gaunt was undoubtedly a capable leader and administrator, his relationship with the ailing prince was complex and multifaceted, often marked by a quiet, underlying rivalry and fundamentally differing approaches to the prosecution of the war in France. Gaunt often advocated for a more pragmatic, financially cautious, and less aggressively destructive strategy, a distinct contrast to Edward's lifelong preference for decisive, often brutal, campaigns designed to force a swift resolution. This divergence in approach sometimes led to friction, unspoken and subtle, yet palpable in the royal court. The weight of national expectation, the quiet hopes and desperate prayers of a weary nation, rested heavily upon Edward during these twilight years. Despite the undeniable reality of his failing health, there was still a lingering, almost desperate, belief among the English populace that he could somehow miraculously regain his strength and lead England to ultimate, definitive victory. He remained the legendary warrior, the symbol of English martial prowess, the one man who, it was believed, could still turn the tide of a war that seemed to be slowly slipping away. Yet, the grim reality was inescapable. The severe physical toll of his illness made any active participation in military command, let alone leading an army in the field, utterly impossible. His once commanding presence, known for its fierce intensity and quiet authority, was now visibly diminished, a mere shadow of its former, formidable self. He remained, however, a potent symbol, a powerful rallying point for English national pride, a figure around whom hopes for victory could still coalesce. His name alone, whispered amongst the common folk and debated in hushed tones in the halls of power, evoked both profound or in a quiet, almost despairing, sense of longing for his return to full health and vigor. On June 8, 1376, in the quiet, somber chambers of Westminster Palace, Edward, the Black Prince, finally succumbed to his prolonged and debilitating illness. He was tragically just 45 years old. His death plunged England into a deep and widespread mourning, a quiet sorrow that settled over the entire kingdom. This profound national grief was a testament to the deep affection, profound admiration, and immense respect he had commanded from all strata of society. He was buried with immense pomp, solemn dignity, and elaborate ceremony in Canterbury Cathedral, a fitting and majestic resting place for a warrior of his extraordinary stature. His tomb, adorned with a magnificent effigy depicting him in his full plate armor, became an immediate and enduring place of pilgrimage, a tangible and powerful link to a legendary figure whose deeds had shaped an era. The inscription on his tomb, carefully crafted and eloquently written in Anglo-Norman French, spoke of his prowess, his piety, and his noble deeds, meticulously constructing a narrative of chivalric virtue that would endure for centuries, shaping perceptions long after the reality had faded. Edward's strategic and tactical innovations left an indelible, transformative mark on medieval warfare, fundamentally altering the way battles were fought and campaigns were waged. His unparalleled mastery of the Chevauchées, transforming it from a mere raiding tactic into a devastating, systematic instrument of economic warfare and psychological terror, fundamentally altered the nature of offensive campaigns in France. He perfected the integrated use of the English longbow, a weapon of seemingly simple design but profound destructive capability, integrating it into a cohesive tactical system that exploited its immense range, rapid rate of fire, and devastating killing power. This allowed English forces to effectively neutralize the traditional dominance of heavily armored cavalry, a revolutionary development. His innate ability to command and inspire fierce loyalty among his diverse troops, leading from the front with a quiet, unwavering courage, made his armies exceptionally effective, even when facing numerically superior forces. These were the quiet lessons learned on countless battlefields, forging a legacy that profoundly shaped the future of military conflict across Europe. However, the legacy of Edward the Black Prince is undeniably complex, a rich and often contradictory tapestry woven with threads of both glorious triumph and grim, unsparing brutality. On one hand, he embodied the quintessential ideal of the chivalrous knight, the courageous warrior, the tactical genius who achieved stunning victories against overwhelming odds, a paragon of martial virtue. This is the image largely propagated by chroniclers of his time and romanticized in later centuries. Yet, on the other hand, the quiet, pervasive suffering inflicted by his widespread chevauchées and, most notably, the deliberate and indiscriminate massacre at Limoges forever stained this heroic image. He was simultaneously the valiant prince and the merciless butcher, a figure who chillingly personified the inherent contradictions and often brutal realities of medieval warfare, where noble ideals frequently clashed violently with desperate necessity and cold strategic calculus. This dual identity, the celebrated knight and the feared killer, ensures that his name remains a subject of ongoing historical debate, fascination, and intense scholarly scrutiny. His impact on the Hundred Years' War was profound, undeniable, and enduring. His decisive victories at Crécy and Poitiers were watershed moments, shattering French morale, capturing their king, and elevating English prestige to unprecedented heights across Europe. They forced the French crown into humiliating concessions, including the Treaty of Bretigny, and secured vast, strategically vital territories for England. While many of these territorial gains were subsequently lost back to the French during his prolonged illness and the strategic genius of King Charles V, Edward's campaigns fundamentally shaped the course and character of the war for decades. They compelled the French to critically re-evaluate and adapt their military strategies, ultimately contributing to the gradual evolution of warfare itself from chivalric spectacle to more pragmatic and devastating conflict. Edward's enduring legacy continues to resonate powerfully in popular culture, literature, and the historical imagination, captivating audiences centuries after his death. He is often depicted as the quintessential medieval knight, a towering symbol of courage, military excellence, and chivalric virtue, the embodiment of a glorious, bygone era. Yet, modern historical scholarship has, with increasing rigor and ethical imperative, scrutinized the darker, more brutal aspects of his campaigns, including the immense civilian suffering and the atrocities committed. This critical re-evaluation ensures a more nuanced, complex, and often critical understanding of his actions and their far-reaching consequences. His story remains a powerful and poignant reminder that history, particularly the history of war and its celebrated figures, is rarely simple, rarely black and white. Even the most renowned and celebrated figures can cast long, intricate, and often disturbing shadows that stretch across the centuries, provoking quiet reflection on the true, devastating cost of conflict and the enduring, multifaceted impact of human actions on the course of nations and the lives of ordinary people.